In the world of modern power, the most dangerous battles are rarely loud, and the most effective weapons are silence, hesitation, and fear. According to the work of Tom Bauer, the story surrounding Meghan Markle is not simply a clash between a woman and an ancient institution, but a slow tightening of invisible pressure, where voices soften, critics retreat, and questions dissolve before they can fully take shape. What makes this story unsettling is not a single scandal or accusation, but a recurring pattern in which people who speak too freely find themselves isolated, discredited, or quietly pushed aside. There is no dramatic order issued, no clear command to silence anyone, yet the outcome is the same. Conversations stop, careers wobble, platforms suddenly feel unsafe. In this atmosphere, truth does not disappear, it merely becomes inconvenient. Bauer describes a figure who arrived at the heart of global attention already armed with a deep understanding of how narratives are built, protected, and redirected. Long before royal titles and palace walls, Meghan had learned how perception works, how headlines can be guided without ever being written by her own hand, and how silence can serve as both shield and sword. When damaging claims emerge, denial is risky, explanation even more so, but silence leaves space for ambiguity, and ambiguity is often where power hides. Those who expect a direct confrontation with the system misunderstand the nature of the game. This is not about shouting back at critics. It is about allowing the environment itself to discipline them. Bauer suggests that many of the strongest reactions to Meghan did not come from the palace at all, but from media institutions, broadcasters, and public figures who sensed that certain criticisms came with consequences. Speak too bluntly, and suddenly sponsors hesitate. Question the narrative, and accusations follow. The message is never explicit, yet it is clearly received. This creates a chilling effect where even neutral observers begin to measure their words, not because they have changed their minds, but because the cost of speaking feels too high. What deepens the intrigue is how seamlessly this modern form of control blends with the emotional language of victimhood and empowerment. Meghan's public story is often framed around struggle, resilience, and injustice, themes that resonate deeply with contemporary audiences. Within that framework, criticism does not land as disagreement, but as cruelty, bias, or moral failure. Bauer does not argue that these themes are fabricated, but he questions how selectively they are deployed and how effectively they reshape the battlefield. In such a climate, challenging the narrative feels less like debate and more like an attack on values, which makes silence the safer option. Over time, this dynamic builds an aura of untouchability. Not because Meghan holds formal authority, but because the ecosystem surrounding her punishes dissent on her behalf. This is where the idea of people trying to silence her becomes more complicated. Are they trying to silence Meghan, or are others being silenced around her? Bauer leans toward the latter, portraying a situation in which Meghan does not need to suppress voices directly, because the structure of modern media, activism, and branding does it automatically. The result is a strange paradox. A woman who claims to be unheard becomes one of the most protected figures in public discourse, while those who question her version of events find themselves labeled, dismissed, or erased. None of this proves malice, but it does reveal how power operates in the 21st century. It is no longer about crowns or commands, but about controlling emotional framing, legal risk, and reputational cost. In this sense, Meghan Markle is not merely a participant in controversy. She is a case study in how influence now works. Her story forces an uncomfortable question. When truth, sympathy, strategy, and silence all collide, who really decides what can be said out loud, and who pays the price for saying it anyway? This is not the end of the story, but the moment where the fog thickens, where certainty fades, and where the line between being silenced and being protected becomes almost impossible to see. Before the world learned to pronounce her name with either devotion or disdain, Meghan Markle lived a life that already revolved around image, access, and positioning. She did not grow up inside the royal bubble, but she was never naive about power either. Raised in Los Angeles, surrounded by the machinery of television sets, casting rooms, and production schedules through her father's work, she absorbed early how stories are constructed and who controls which angles are shown. Success in that environment is rarely accidental. It rewards those who understand perception as much as talent. And long before royalty entered the picture, Meghan had learned to curate herself carefully. College years sharpened that awareness further, combining ambition with discipline. And when she stepped into acting, she did so with a mindset closer to strategy than fantasy. Hollywood did not open its doors easily. Roles were limited, visibility fragile, and relevance constantly at risk. Her time on Suits brought financial stability and recognition, but also taught her something crucial. Fame is temporary unless managed. During those years, she built the TIG, a lifestyle platform that revealed another side of her skill set, branding. She understood tone, audience targeting, and timing. She learned how vulnerability attracts attention and how empowerment builds loyalty. These were not mistakes or accidents, they were tools. According to Tom Bauer, this background explains why Meghan did not enter royal life as a passive outsider. She arrived with instincts already trained for visibility, messaging, and leverage. When she met Prince Harry, the collision between celebrity culture and monarchy created immediate tension. The royal system operates on restraint, patience, and silence. Hollywood operates on momentum, exposure, and narrative dominance. Meghan stood at the intersection of these worlds, and rather than choosing one, she attempted to balance both. That balancing act quickly became unstable. Palace aides reportedly found her impatient with protocol, while she found the institution rigid and emotionally distant. Each side misunderstood the other. To the palace, discipline preserves legitimacy. To Meghan, discipline felt like erasure. The pressure intensified as media attention exploded. Every gesture became symbolic, every silence interpreted. Meghan responded the way she knew best, by shaping her story emotionally rather than procedurally. She framed her experience through themes of isolation, misunderstanding, and quiet suffering, language that resonates strongly in modern culture. This approach won her public sympathy, particularly outside the United Kingdom, but also alarmed insiders who believe she was undermining the monarchy's unwritten rules. Bauer describes how this mismatch of expectations hardened into conflict. Meghan expected protection, advocacy, and flexibility. The institution expected adaptation, restraint, and loyalty. Neither side fully yielded. As criticism mounted, Meghan's instinct was not to retreat, but to clarify her truth through selective openness. Interviews, carefully chosen allies, and strategic silences replaced traditional royal invisibility. Over time, this created an environment where supporters viewed any criticism as persecution, while critics viewed her messaging as manipulation. The middle ground disappeared. Those who knew her before royalty noticed patterns that now seemed amplified. Relationships that cooled quickly once their utility faded, abrupt shifts in tone depending on audience, and a willingness to abandon old identities for more powerful ones. None of this is inherently immoral, but within the rigid moral symbolism of royalty, it became explosive. The royal family does not operate on intention alone. It operates on optics accumulated over centuries. Meghan operated on immediacy, personal truth, and emotional framing. The result was a slow rupture. When Meghan and Harry stepped back from royal duties, the story transformed again. What could have been a quiet withdrawal became a public reckoning. Deals with global media platforms followed, turning personal grievances into consumable narratives. Critics questioned how calls for privacy could coexist with primetime exposure. Supporters argued this was the only way to reclaim agency. Bauer positions this moment as pivotal. It revealed that Meghan no longer sought accommodation within the system, but separation from it, on her own terms. That decision reshaped everything that followed. Former allies grew cautious. Journalists recalculated risks. Public figures learned that speaking freely carried consequences. Not because Meghan demanded silence, but because the climate around her punished dissent. This is where her past becomes essential to understanding the present. She did not stumble into power. She evolved toward it. Each stage of her life reinforced the same lesson: control your story or someone else will. By the time she faced the most ancient institution in Britain, she was already fluent in modern influence. The tragedy, if there is one, lies in the incompatibility of these worlds. A woman trained in visibility entered a system built on invisibility. Neither could fully bend without breaking. And as the fracture widened, the cost was paid not only by Meghan and the royals, but by everyone caught in between: friends, critics, commentators, and institutions forced to choose sides in a story that no longer allowed neutrality. The moment everything shifted was not announced with trumpets or formal declarations. It arrived quietly, disguised as concern, framed as confession, and delivered through carefully chosen platforms that reached millions at once. As pressure inside the royal system intensified, the private disagreements that once lived behind palace walls spilled into the public domain, transforming personal frustration into a global spectacle. According to the research of Tom Bauer, this was the point where tension hardened into open conflict, not because of a single argument, but because silence stopped working for one side, while exposure became the only perceived escape. Inside the palace, Meghan Markle felt increasingly constrained. Rules that had governed royal life for generations now felt suffocating rather than protective. Every outfit, every word, every facial expression was scrutinized, not only by the press but by the institution itself. Requests for clarity were met with procedure. Appeals for emotional support were redirected into protocol. In that environment, frustration grew quietly but relentlessly. Meghan's response was not to withdraw inward, but to look outward toward the tools she knew best: storytelling, emotion, visibility. What began as a desire to be understood slowly evolved into a strategy to be heard. The turning point came when personal struggles were no longer framed as internal challenges, but as systemic failures. Conversations about mental health, isolation, and fear became public narratives rather than private negotiations. This shift resonated powerfully with audiences far beyond Britain, particularly in the United States, where openness is often seen as courage rather than breach of duty. Yet within the royal framework, this was seen as dangerous. The monarchy survives on continuity and discretion. When inner turmoil becomes public testimony, the illusion of unity cracks. Palace insiders reportedly felt blindsided, believing long-standing rules had been broken without warning. As the story escalated, alliances fractured. Some staff members quietly exited. Others retreated into silence. Long-trusted relationships cooled overnight. Meghan, meanwhile, felt increasingly justified in telling her side, convinced that silence only benefited those unwilling to protect her. When she and Prince Harry made the decision to step back from royal duties, it was framed publicly as a bid for peace. But behind the scenes, it marked a point of no return. Separation was no longer symbolic, it was structural. What followed was unprecedented. Instead of fading into quiet exile, the couple entered the global media marketplace with speed and precision. Interviews, documentaries, and projects reframed their experience as a moral reckoning rather than a family dispute. The narrative expanded beyond palace walls, touching on themes of race, power, and emotional survival. Supporters saw bravery. Critics saw contradiction. How could a demand for privacy coexist with carefully orchestrated exposure? This question became central, but it was never resolved because both sides were speaking from different definitions of control. For Meghan, control meant ownership of her story. For the institution, control meant containment of damage. These definitions collided violently. Each new appearance reignited debate. Each silence fueled speculation. The media's cycle fed on the contradiction, amplifying every detail. Meanwhile, those who openly challenged Meghan's version of events began to experience backlash. Public figures lost platforms. Broadcasters faced internal pressure. Even neutral commentary became risky, not because of direct retaliation, but because the environment had shifted. The cost of dissent had risen. Bauer describes this period as one where power became diffuse. No single actor dictated outcomes, yet the system responded predictably. Sympathy mobilized audiences. Outrage disciplined critics. Corporations chose safety over controversy. In this climate, Meghan's critics did not need to be silenced directly. Many silenced themselves. Careers built over decades suddenly felt fragile. A single misstep could be reframed as cruelty, bias, or moral failure. Silence became survival. At the same time, Meghan herself faced a different kind of isolation. Public support did not equal institutional belonging. Former friends drifted away. Family ties frayed. The emotional cost of permanent visibility became evident. Every move was interpreted as strategy. Every pause as calculation. The humanity behind the narrative risked being swallowed by the narrative itself. Yet retreat was no longer possible. The story had grown larger than the individuals at its center. This phase of the saga revealed something deeper than personal conflict. It exposed how modern power operates when emotion, media, and identity intersect. Meghan did not overthrow a system. She collided with it, using the tools of her world against the structures of another. The result was not victory or defeat, but transformation. The monarchy survived, but changed. Meghan left, but remained central to the conversation. Critics spoke, then fell silent. Supporters rallied, then questioned. No one emerged untouched. As the dust settled, one truth became clear. This was no longer about a duchess unhappy with palace life. It was about what happens when personal truth becomes public currency, when storytelling becomes leverage, and when silence becomes both weapon and wound. The recent events did not resolve the tension. They locked it into place. Meghan Markle became a symbol, not just of rebellion or resilience, but the uneasy balance between vulnerability and power in the modern age. And in that balance, everyone involved lost something. Privacy, trust, stability, certainty. What remained was a story still unfolding, shaped not by official statements or royal decrees, but by perception, reaction, and the relentless machinery of attention. The conflict had escaped the palace entirely, entering a space where there were no rules, only consequences. What followed the public rupture was not resolution, but fallout that spread quietly and unevenly, touching people who never expected to become collateral damage. According to Tom Bauer, this phase revealed the true cost of the conflict, not in headlines or view counts, but in careers altered, relationships severed, and an atmosphere of caution that lingered long after the cameras moved on. The consequences were not dramatic explosions. They were slow, professional suffocations. Invitations stopped arriving. Opinions were softened mid-sentence. Once confident commentators suddenly spoke in disclaimers. The system adjusted itself. For Meghan Markle, the aftermath was paradoxical. Publicly, she appeared freer than ever. No palace schedules, no royal press offices, no silent rules she had never agreed to. She spoke openly about pain, identity, and survival. She was praised for courage, celebrated as a voice for those who felt unseen. Yet behind that empowerment lay a growing isolation. The more visible she became, the fewer people could approach her without calculation. Every interaction carried risk. Every friendship invited scrutiny. Support came loudly from afar, but quietly disappeared up close. The most visible casualties emerged in media. Broadcasters who questioned Meghan's claims found themselves under investigation or public pressure. Some lost long-held positions. Others issued apologies that felt more strategic than sincere. In many cases, no direct link to Meghan could be proven. There were no emails, no orders, no threats. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Speak critically, and consequences follow. The chilling effect deepened. Editors became careful. Producers chose safer voices. The range of acceptable opinion narrowed. Bauer highlights how this environment changed behavior even among those who disliked Meghan. They did not suddenly believe her critics were wrong. They simply stopped saying so publicly. The risk was too high. Reputational damage spreads faster than facts. In a modern media economy, controversy threatens revenue, not just image. Brands withdrew quietly. Platforms prioritized stability. Silence became a business decision. Within the royal family, the consequences were equally profound, though less visible. Trust fractured. Private conversations became guarded. The institution, built on discretion, had been exposed to a form of public vulnerability it was never designed to withstand. While the monarchy survived, it emerged more cautious, more defensive, and less willing to engage emotionally with outsiders. Meghan's departure reinforced long-standing fears about modern celebrity clashing with ancient power. The walls grew higher, not lower. For Prince Harry, the fallout carried its own weight. Torn between loyalty and love, identity and duty, he became a symbol of loss on both sides. To some, he betrayed his heritage. To others, he escaped it. But in either framing, the cost was personal. Distance from family, estrangement from tradition, and a public identity now inseparable from conflict. The promise of peace proved elusive. Freedom did not end scrutiny. It intensified it. Meghan's commercial ventures also felt the strain. Initial enthusiasm met reality. Audiences grew skeptical. Projects were judged not on content alone, but on symbolism. Every release reignited old debates. Critics questioned sincerity. Supporters defended intention. The cycle repeated. Momentum slowed. The power of controversy waned as fatigue set in. Being polarizing sustains attention only so long. Eventually, even outrage becomes routine. Perhaps the most striking consequence was psychological. Living permanently inside a contested narrative erodes clarity. When every action is interpreted as strategy, authenticity becomes suspect. Meghan spoke of healing, but healing is difficult when the past is constantly replayed in public. The line between self-protection and self-performance blurred. Supporters demanded consistency. Critics hunted contradictions. The space to simply exist shrank. Bauer notes that this is where the story becomes tragic rather than scandalous. No one fully wins. Meghan escaped a system she felt was harming her, but entered another that never forgets. The monarchy preserved its structure, but lost a sense of moral authority from many observers. Media outlets gained clicks, but lost trust. Individuals on all sides paid professional and emotional prices disproportionate to their roles. The fallout also revealed something unsettling about modern power. Accountability no longer requires authority. It requires momentum. Once a narrative takes hold, systems respond automatically. Careers end not because of proven wrongdoing, but because association becomes dangerous. This is not justice or injustice. It is risk management, and it leaves little room for nuance. As time passed, the intensity faded, but the damage remained. Friendships did not recover. Reputations did not fully heal. The silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion, a collective decision to move on without closure. Yet unresolved stories do not disappear. They wait. The consequences of this saga continue to ripple outward, shaping how institutions handle outsiders, how media handles controversy, and how individuals weigh truth against survival. What began as a personal struggle became a lesson in modern consequence. Power exercised quietly, punishment delivered indirectly, and silence accepted as the safest outcome. And in that silence, the most important questions remain unanswered. Not because no one asks them, but because fewer people are willing to speak the answers out loud. Behind the public statements and televised moments lies a quieter layer of the story, one that rarely trends but carries the greatest emotional weight. According to Tom Bauer, the most revealing details of Meghan Markle's journey are not found in interviews or documentaries, but in what vanished along the way. Friendships that ended without explanation. Family ties that dissolved into distance. People who once stood close, then faded into silence, never to be acknowledged again. These absences form a pattern that feels deliberate, even if it is never openly addressed. Before royalty, Meghan maintained a wide circle of acquaintances across Hollywood, Toronto, and social media. She was known for warmth, ambition, and an ability to connect quickly. Yet as her status evolved, those circles narrowed sharply. Old friends disappeared from photographs. Former confidants stopped speaking publicly. Some claimed they were cut off abruptly, without conflict or closure. Others refused to comment at all, choosing discretion over controversy. Bauer suggests this was not accidental. In moments of rapid ascent, relationships can become liabilities. Silence becomes safer than explanation. One recurring theme is Meghan's ability to compartmentalize her life. Each chapter appears sealed once it ends. Her first marriage, once publicly celebrated, vanished almost overnight. Her former husband never spoke, never sold his story, never responded. The silence was striking, not because it was enforced, but because it was absolute. That pattern repeated with other relationships. Those left behind often described confusion rather than anger, a sense of being erased rather than rejected. In a culture that values closure, this absence of acknowledgement cut deeply. Family dynamics added another layer of quiet pain. While public attention focused on royal tensions, a more intimate rupture unfolded in parallel. Her father's isolation, her half-sister's bitterness, and the collapse of familial trust played out through tabloid headlines and court filings, yet Meghan herself remained distant from the noise. She rarely addressed these relationships directly, allowing others to speak while she stayed silent. Supporters viewed this as self-preservation. Critics saw calculation. Bauer frames it as consistency. When a connection no longer aligns with the future she envisions, is left behind. These choices did not come without cost. Isolation grew alongside success. The fewer people who truly know you, the harder it becomes to separate reality from performance. Meghan's public persona became polished, controlled, and emotionally articulate, yet insiders suggested a private exhaustion beneath the surface. Constant vigilance replaces spontaneity. Trust becomes conditional. Every interaction is weighed for risk. In such an environment, silence is not just a strategy. It is survival. There are also quieter professional sacrifices. Opportunities declined that did not fit the narrative she was building. Projects that required compromise were avoided. Critics argue this limited her range. Supporters argue it preserved her values. Either way, it narrowed her world. The freedom she sought came with invisible boundaries. Fame without institutional backing is fragile. Every move must justify itself. Bauer notes that these silent stories reveal a deeper tension within Meghan herself. The desire for authenticity collides with the necessity of control. She speaks passionately about truth, yet curates which truths are shared. She advocates vulnerability, yet shields large parts of her past from view. This is not hypocrisy so much as adaptation. In the modern spotlight, exposure without control is dangerous. Meghan chose control, even when it meant emotional distance. Those who once knew her describe conflicting impressions. Some recall kindness and generosity. Others recall ambition that overshadowed loyalty. Both can be true. Human beings are rarely consistent across contexts. What changes is which traits are rewarded. In Meghan's world, decisiveness and self-preservation were rewarded more than nostalgia or obligation. The cost was quiet but cumulative. Perhaps the most haunting element is how these silent stories never fully disappear. They resurface indirectly through lawsuits, memoirs, and secondhand accounts. Each reappearance adds another layer of complexity. Meghan's refusal to engage keeps the narrative unresolved. Supporters admire the restraint. Critics see avoidance. But restraint itself can be a form of power. By not responding, she denies closure, leaving others to speak into a void. In this silence, Meghan built a new identity. Activist, mother, public figure brand, each role carefully maintained. Yet the question lingers. What is lost when the past is sealed so tightly? What emotional debts remain unpaid? Bauer does not claim to know her inner life, but he points to the evidence of absence. A life reshaped so thoroughly that earlier versions become unreachable. These quiet stories matter because they humanize the saga. Beyond institutions and media wars, there is a person making choices under immense pressure. Choices that protect one future while erasing another. Choices that trade connection for control. Whether those choices were necessary or costly depends on perspective, but their impact is undeniable. In the end, the silence surrounding these relationships speaks louder than any accusation. It suggests a woman who learned early that survival in powerful systems requires precision, not sentiment. Yet it also raises a fragile question. When everything is managed, curated, and protected, where does grief go? Where do unresolved bonds rest? They do not vanish. They linger quietly, shaping what comes next. Time has a way of stripping stories down to what truly lasts. When the noise fades and the headlines lose urgency, what remains is not the outrage or applause, but the imprint a person leaves on the systems they pass through. According to Tom Bauer, Meghan Markle's legacy cannot be measured by titles gained or lost, nor by interviews watched or criticized. It is measured by disruption. She entered an institution built on invisibility and forced it into a conversation it never wanted to have, then walked away before the conversation could settle. That act alone altered the landscape. For some, Meghan represents progress, a woman who refused to accept silence as the price of belonging, a figure who challenged tradition with personal truth and insisted that emotional suffering mattered, even within a centuries-old system. To her supporters, the backlash proves her point. The resistance she faced becomes evidence of why change is necessary. In this reading, her story is one of courage and endurance. She spoke when speaking was discouraged and survived when retreat would have been easier. For others, her legacy is far more complicated. They see a pattern of selective vulnerability and strategic exposure. They question whether her actions empowered reform or merely shifted attention from structural change to personal narrative. In this view, Meghan did not transform the institution. She collided with it, extracted what she needed, and left chaos behind. The system endured, but trust eroded. Sympathy turned into fatigue. A moment that could have inspired reflection hardened into division. What makes her legacy so difficult to define is that both interpretations coexist. Meghan embodies a contradiction central to modern fame. Authenticity and performance are no longer opposites. They overlap. She speaks openly about pain, yet chooses the moment, platform, and framing with precision. She demands privacy, yet understands the power of visibility. This duality frustrates critics and fascinates audiences. It ensures relevance but resists resolution. Beyond public debate, the quieter legacy is psychological. Meghan's journey illustrates the cost of permanent exposure. Once a person becomes symbolic, their humanity is constantly negotiated. Every decision is scrutinized. Every silence interpreted. Healing becomes performative, even when sincere. The self becomes fragmented, divided between who you are, who you were, and who the world expects you to be next. That fragmentation is not unique to Meghan, but her story magnifies it. There's also a lesson for institutions. The monarchy learned that secrecy is no longer a shield. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation spreads faster than correction. Meghan forced the royal family to confront a media ecosystem that does not respect tradition or patience. While the institution survived, it now moves more cautiously, aware that internal conflict can no longer be contained. The cost of that awareness is rigidity. Openness becomes risk. Media, too, carries a legacy from this saga. The line between accountability and spectacle blurred. Journalists learned that certain topics invite disproportionate backlash. Opinion became dangerous. Nuance became expendable. This environment did not begin with Meghan, but her story accelerated it. Silence became professionalism. Ambiguity became safety. For Meghan herself, legacy remains unfinished. She continues to build projects, identities, and causes. Motherhood adds another layer, reshaping priorities and reframing past choices. Yet the shadow of the royal conflict follows her. It colors interpretation. It anchors her public image to a single narrative, regardless of future achievements. Escaping that gravity may prove harder than escaping the palace itself. Bauer's work suggests that Meghan's true legacy may not be reform or rebellion, but exposure. She exposed how modern power functions without commands, how silence disciplines more effectively than censorship, how sympathy can shield influence, how systems adapt not through confrontation, but through quiet avoidance. In that sense, she is less a villain or hero and more mirror, a reflection of how society handles discomfort. The question her story leaves behind is unsettling. In a world where visibility equals power and silence equals survival, what space remains for honest disagreement? If every critique risks moral condemnation and every defense risks blind loyalty, dialogue collapses. Meghan's saga demonstrates how easily this collapse happens, even with good intentions on all sides. Legacy is rarely chosen. It is assigned over time. Meghan Markle will likely be remembered as a woman who refused to disappear quietly. Whether that refusal healed wounds or deepened them remains contested. But the impact is undeniable. She changed the conversation, even if she did not control where it went. As years pass, the emotional heat will cool. What remains will be patterns, lessons, and cautionary tales. About ambition meeting tradition. About vulnerability meeting power. About the cost of speaking and the cost of silence. Meghan's story sits at that intersection, unresolved and instructive. And perhaps that is her lasting mark. Not clarity, but tension. Not closure, but a question that lingers long after the noise fades. In a culture obsessed with certainty, she leaves behind ambiguity. And in that ambiguity, everyone is forced to confront what they believe about truth, power, and the price of being heard. When the story finally slows, when the outrage cycles thin out and the arguments repeat themselves without resolution, what lingers is not a verdict, but a feeling. A sense that something larger than one woman or one institution has been exposed and left unfinished. Meghan Markle's journey ends this chapter not with triumph or defeat, but with distance. Distance from the palace she once entered, distance from critics who once dominated the conversation, and distance even from supporters who now watch more quietly than before. The noise has softened, but the tension remains. Her name still triggers instant reactions. Admiration, irritation, exhaustion, loyalty. Few public figures generate such immediate polarization. That alone explains why the story refuses to die. It is no longer about specific claims or rebuttals. It has become a symbol onto which people project their beliefs about power, victimhood, ambition, and responsibility. Each side feels morally certain, and moral certainty leaves little room for closure. What is striking is how silence now plays a different role. Early on, silence felt like pressure. Later, it felt like avoidance. Now it feels like fatigue. Audiences have heard the arguments. Institutions have recalibrated. Media has moved on to fresher conflicts. Yet Meghan remains suspended in a narrative that never fully resolves. Every attempt to pivot toward a new identity pulls the past back into focus. Every new project is filtered through old questions. Escape proves harder than departure. For Meghan, the future appears carefully managed. She chooses causes aligned with her values, projects that reinforce her voice, and appearances that maintain relevance without reopening old wounds. Motherhood reframes her public image, softening edges while deepening scrutiny. Critics continue to search for contradictions. Supporters continue to defend intention. The cycle persists, quieter but intact. For the monarchy, the story closes without apology or reconciliation. The institution absorbs disruption by outlasting it. It does not argue. It waits. Over time, controversy becomes history. Meghan's departure reinforced long-held instincts about containment and distance. The walls remain, perhaps higher than before. Change, if it comes, will be slow and indirect. The media learned its own lessons. The price of strong opinion became clearer. Silence became safer. Nuance became rare. Meghan's saga did not create this environment, but it crystallized it. Careers were reshaped by risk assessment rather than conviction. The chilling effect remains long after the headlines fade. Yet the most lasting impact may be internal. Meghan's story reflects the psychological cost of being perpetually interpreted. When identity becomes contested terrain, self-definition requires constant defense. Vulnerability turns strategic. Authenticity becomes suspect. Healing competes with performance. This is not unique to her, but her visibility magnifies it. She carries not only her own story, but the expectations of millions who see themselves reflected in her struggle. As time moves forward, new narratives will emerge. Other figures will replace her in the spotlight, but the questions her story raised will linger. Can personal truth coexist with institutional loyalty? Can vulnerability exist without becoming leverage? Can silence protect without erasing? These questions do not belong to Meghan alone. They belong to a culture still learning how power works when emotion, media, and identity collide. In the end, Meghan Markle remains what she has always been since entering the global stage. A catalyst. She did not resolve the contradictions she exposed, but she forced them into view. Whether that exposure leads to understanding or deeper division depends on what others do with it. The story closes not with certainty, but with a pause. A moment where the audience must decide what they believe they witnessed. Was this a woman silenced by a system, or a strategist who mastered it? Was this a necessary disruption, or an avoidable fracture? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that is why the debate never settles. What remains undeniable is this. Meghan Markle changed the conversation, even if she could not control its outcome. She stepped into a space designed to erase individuality and refused to disappear quietly. The cost was high. The consequences spread far beyond her. And the silence that followed speaks not of peace, but of unresolved tension. The final judgment is not delivered here. It belongs to time, distance, and perspective. Until then, the story rests in ambiguity, where admiration and skepticism coexist, and where the truth, like power itself, remains contested.